For today is Gustavo Barbosa, who is an associate researcher at the Center of Middle East Studies in Universidade Federal Fluminense. In Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and an MSc also from the London School of Economics and another MSc from the Universidade Federal de Rio de Janeiro. He's published several articles both in English and Portuguese, and he has a new book just out, Best of Hard Times, Palestinian Refugee Masculinities in Lebanon. And if I'm correct, he's also served in diplomatic capacity for many years. So please welcome Gustavo for today's talk.
Thank you. So let me begin by Let me begin by thanking the Macmillan Center and the Council on Middle East Studies for enabling my trip to New Haven for this book talk. I also want to thank those who were actually involved in organizing this event, Vish, Lizzie, Christina, and Marwa. And a big and heartfelt thanks to Marsha Inhorn, because she has been a never-failing supporter of my book project from the very beginning. My book, The Best of Hard Times, would not have seen the light of the day were it not for her. As I mentioned in the acknowledgements of the book, Marsha's example, both as an academic, as a human being, is something I hope to be able in a position to replicate one day. So it's due to her that I have come to think of Yale as my academic home in the United States. So I'm indeed feeling at home now. And finally, I want to thank you all, both those who are here and those who are online, for being with me here today. What I'll present to you are some of the main arguments from my book, The Best of Hard Times, Palestinian Refugee Masculinities in Lebanon, which has just been published by Syracuse. So let's begin. It was an oppressively hot evening in the summer of 2007 during my pre-field trip to Lebanon. I was attending an English class for Palestinian refugee adults in the Mar Elias camp in West Beirut. As the students' command of English varied considerably, the teacher spoke mainly in Arabic. For a moment, she switched into English to say gender equity before returning to Arabic. I decided to provoke her. You don't actually have a word for gender in Arabic. The teacher replied, of course we do. It's jeans. I didn't retreat. Jeans is actually sex, isn't it? It's not gender. She didn't retreat either and responded, jeans is sex. Jeans is also gender. And to get back to her class and force me to shut up, she added, there isn't a problem here, all right? In this talk, I asked how lads, or Shabab, from the Shatila Palestinian refugee camp or the southern outskirts of Beirut, come of age today and display gender belonging. In Palestine, before 1948, men came of age by marrying, having a son, and providing for their families. For the Palestinian diaspora in Lebanon throughout the 1970s, acting as a fidai or a fighter worked as an alternative mechanism for coming of age and displaying gender belonging. But currently, both the economic and the political military avenues have ceased to be options available to the Shatila Shabab. My initial Marxist-inspired research question, which became much more nuanced along the way, was, what happens to men like the Shatila Shabab who cannot provide for their families? The answer to this question is far from obvious, particularly when we take into consideration two factors. Firstly, Lebanese legislation, through what I call institutional violence, bars Palestinian refugees from free access to the labor market, forcing the Shabab to postpone marriage plans. So the economic avenue has ceased to be the straightforward track for coming of age and display of gender belonging that it used to be before 1948, and that precisely in a place situated in the Arab East, the region considered by much of the feminist literature as the bedrock of patriarchy. Secondly, the Palestinian resistance movement in its military form no longer exists in Lebanon. Hence, the political military avenue for coming of age and displaying adequate gender belonging is not open to the Shabab either, unlike the case during the 1970s. And this, in Shatila, the place often identified by the literature on Palestinian nationalism as a bedrock of Palestinian resistance. By comparing the heroic trajectories of an older generation of refugees who were fighters during the 1970s and the much more mundane trajectories of their sons, today's Shabab, with their very limited access to economic and political military power, not only does the full historicity and pliability of masculinity in time and space become apparent, but so too can the scholarly concept of gender be transformed and undone. Instead of portraying the Shabab as emasculated or living a crisis of masculinity for being unable to live up to the demands of an ideal typical hegemonic masculinity, I take issue with the concept of gender itself. Indeed, if defined only in terms of power and relations of domination, gender may even help us to understand the biographies of the fathers, the Fidain, but it fails to grasp the experience of those, like the Shatila Shabab, with very limited access to power. This is a lesson to be learned, I argue, by those studying gender in the Middle East and also beyond. I'll begin my talk today by drawing on Shatila's eventful and scarred history so as to contextualize the different predicaments of the Fidain and the Shabab. Next, making use of biographies from both groups, I demonstrate how their trajectories contrast and how masculinity changed from one period to the other. After that, I indicate how Shabab do the gender, if we want to keep this word. I do so by describing the attempts at self-expression, first through rap, and then, after taking a quick shortcut via a workshop on gender held at a Shakira NGO, through pigeon raising, or what I provocatively call non-cockfights. I'll wrap up my talk returning to the English teacher from the Maya Elias camp, demonstrating that in Arabic, the concept of sex or gender encapsulated in the word genes invites us to navigate alternative semantic universes. Let me also share with you the path of my research. I lived in Shatila for 1 year, between 2008 and 2009. Fieldwork basically consisted of informal interactions with young refugee men and their fathers, 3 workshops that used nationalistic songs and present-day rap music to provoke debates, interviews with 16 pairs of fathers and sons, and sometimes mothers and daughters, first separately and then together, and finally, a household survey with 39 families. Now, I'll show you an excerpt from what I consider to be one of the best documentaries about Shatila, the movie Roundabout Shatila from 2005 by Maher Absambra. Though a bit dated, what I particularly like about this excerpt is that it places Shatila at the center of complex and intermingling circles of causality, showing how the lives of campus residents are overdetermined by instances well beyond their control. So let's watch the excerpt, and then Maroya, it's the first one. here is yeah, it's okay? Yeah, it's 1982, the turning point in the Palestinian saga in Lebanon. The period before then, starting in the late 1960s, but especially after 1970, when the Palestinian leadership, forced out of Jordan, moved to Lebanon and installed its headquarters in the immediate vicinity of Shatila, those years were what an older generation of Palestinians referred to as the glorious days of the revolution, the Yom Thawra. These days of the revolution marked the peak in the strength of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, in Lebanon. The iconic figure associated with this period is precisely the Fidai, the Palestinian resistance fighter. The very word refers to a man who is willing to sacrifice himself in the fight to reconquer the motherland. Posters from this period often celebrated this figure, portraying him in all his courage and pride, walking on the crest of the hills, with a kofia, the traditional Arab scarf covering his head, and a bunduia, the Kalashnikov machine gun in his hand, proceeding to military incursions deep into Palestine. It is with nostalgia that Ahmad, a 31-year-old unemployed accountant from Shatila, remembers growing up during the Yom Thawra. Let's listen to him. The Fidaiin were like Conan, walking the alleys of the camp, all powerful with their guns attached to the waist. We so much wanted to be like them. There is bitterness in Ahmad's recollection. The life of this lad or Shab from Shatila could not be further away from that of a Fidai. His biography reflects the 1982 turning point in the Palestinian trajectory in Lebanon. That year, the forced evacuation of the PLO and the massacre of thousands of Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila marked the demise of the Yom Thawra. The official end of the Lebanese Civil War, marked by the 1999 Taif Agreement, sanctioned Palestinian exclusion and scapegoating. A 1962 law, for instance, made more stringent precisely in 1982, forbade Palestinians from working in 72 professions and trades. Unemployment levels among refugees remain very high, hitting the Shabab particularly hard. The time has now come to populate Shatila's scarred history with ethnography and real life. So let's see how the trajectories of a Shab and a Fidai can help us problematize gender as a concept. Nawaf, 28, a clerical worker and aspiring painter, told me about his love life. After a couple of short-lived relationships, he first discovered the pleasures of sex with a European activist. When she returned to Europe, Nawaf didn't have the means or visas to follow her. Another European activist who had moved to Lebanon to give her support to the Palestinian cause captured his attention shortly after. This time, though, he was the one who decided to put an end to the relationship. Nawaf explained to me his reasons. You know, Gustavo, she loved the Palestine in me. What she liked most about me was a Palestinian hero that I know I can't afford to be. Nawaf's gloomy love life and the relationships he can't afford to have sets a dissonant tone to the Fidaiin's heroic accomplishments. The feminine is avoided in the Fidaiin's recollections of the heroic deeds during the glorious Yom Thawra, the days of the revolution. The nationalistic discourse and the Fidaiin's narratives collude to frame Palestinian men's passage from boyhood into manhood within a hegemonic notion of masculinity. This purges the emasculating effects of refugee lives in Lebanon and shuns feminine spatial and symbolic spheres. To prepare themselves for the fight to reconquer the motherland, Palestine, depicted in Palestinian imagery as a woman victim of a rape in 1948, the Fidaiin had to detach themselves from another motherland, home. The way in which Abu Fawzi, 62, an ex-Fatah commando, talks about his biography is fairly typical. He says, I joined the Fidaiin without my family knowing. When they found out, my mother cried a lot, and my father forced me into my first marriage, hoping I'd leave the Fidaiin. But my marriage didn't last. I gave up my wife, but not the Thawra, the revolution. In my work, I explore how Shabab biographies and experiences of coming of age, such as Nawaf's, differ from those of the Fida'in, like Abu Fawzi. With the Palestinian resistance movement in its military facet increasingly demobilizing Lebanon from the 1990s onwards, Abu Fawzi's extraordinary heroism cannot simply be reenacted by Nawaf, a fact that bespeaks the full historicity of masculinity in time. During our interview, Abu Fawzi showed me the pronounced scar on his leg, proof of his intrepid activities as a Fidai, which included several incursions deep into Palestine. He bragged to me, "I still have a very strong body. I did wrestling when I was younger. In our struggle, we never stop. We don't retire. We fight until we die." Indeed, he still defines himself as a fighter. I go on thinking of myself as a Fidai. I never look back, only towards the future. And I never feel sorry for what I did. This made me the man I am today. The future belongs to those who fight and don't accept defeat. Throughout our conversation, a question kept crisscrossing my mind. What's it like to kill someone? But I never verbalized it. Instead, having seen a carefully kept cigar box on one of the shelves in Abu Fawzi's sitting room, I made a mental note that I should offer him a Habano. A couple of months later, I did. It's indeed difficult not to bow in awe in the presence of a Fidai narrating his heroic deeds. But I knew that I could not go on providing an all-attentive and compliant audience to these narratives, because such discourses on hegemonic masculinity present in the Fida'in's remembrances cost the Shabab dear. The Fida'in were all power, all gender is precisely a discourse on power, all public, all spectacle. The narratives amalgamate everything that the heroic 1970s stand for: territorial nationalism, third worldism, socialism. But certain tropes from the 70s have become an impossibility for those coming after, like the Shatila Shabab or myself. With European activists gone, Nawaf, the clerical worker we met a few minutes ago, finally found his goal. The European woman's departure had an awakening effect for him. He decided the time had come to take his life seriously. He regretted having ignored the needs of his family when he was with the European. And there was a camp girl, Jamila. They started dating away from the scrutinizing eyes of her family. But Jamila, knowing how much was at stake for a camp girl like herself, forced Nawaf's meeting with her father so that the two could get engaged. The outcome was not what the two were hoping for. When I met Nawaf, he was trying to recover from the breakup. Jamila's father insisted that the couple married 1 year after the engagement, but Nawaf needed 2 years to finish his university degree. No agreement could be reached. When we talked, Nawaf was trying to figure ways to graduate fast and then build a house so that he might still have a chance to marry the love of his life. The ethnographies of the particular I write about in my book depict Shatila Shabab, to quote from Abu Luhod, not only making mistakes, enduring tragedies and personal losses and finding moments of happiness, but also trying to make themselves look good. Theirs is a moral quest to be good men, even if and when it may not be possible to be good at being men. But the failure to fulfill certain expectations placed on them is in no way indicative of a crisis of masculinity. Rather, it suggested the need to promote another crisis of an epistemological nature, the crisis of gender and hegemonic masculinity discourses. Inhorn lists some of the features characterizing what she ironically and critically, let me state that very clearly because this led to some misunderstanding previous times in this talk. So what she ironically and critically calls hegemonic masculinity in Middle Eastern style: patriarchy, polygyny, hypervirility, tribalism, violence, militarism, and Islamic jihad. The experiences of the Shatila Shabab with their very limited access to power find no comfortable place within this theoretical framework. Nawaf's dilemma between finishing his university or making money fast to afford marriage with the girl he loves bears testimony to the difficulty of fulfilling certain ideals, including gender ideals. While the Fidain's recollections contribute to the ideology of hegemonic masculinity, the Shatila Shabab expose the difference between that ideology and their own gender and other practices. If the Fidain's reminiscences reserve no place for the feminine, hegemonic masculinity also operates through omissions. Within such discourses, the Shabab current experiences disappear from purview. They come across as unworthy of consideration. On an epistemological level, the outcome is predictable. Non-homosexual men with limited access to power have no place in hegemonic masculinity discourses. But for an ethnographic analysis, this remains unjustifiable. Inhor contends that we need to rethink whether patriarchy should remain our dominant theoretical trope. By nuancing our patriarchal polemics and opening them up to more closely reflect ethnographic findings, she anticipates that men in the Middle East would not necessarily emerge as always patriarchal, hyper-virile, brutal, and religiously fanatical. Whereas ideals of manhood may reveal a certain obstinate persistence, the way manhood is lived in practice changes from place to place and time to time as the social contexts vary from one generation to the other. For example, the eventual gap between ideal and practice does not necessarily entail a crisis of masculinity. Crises of masculinity discourses are in reality required for the functioning of certain theories and frameworks of hegemonic masculinity and patriarchy. If men, for whatever reason, cannot fulfill the expectations placed on them, their masculinity is taken to be in crisis and by heuristic feared. Rather than turning the analysis to changes in practices of manhood at varying times and spaces, crisis of masculinity scholars proceed to an epistemic freezing of the ideal. The fact that men in very specific parts of the world are taken to be in crisis or cannot live up to the demands of an atavistic, misogynist, and hypersexual masculinity, as in pseudo-anthropological and psychological behavioralist approaches, feeds terrorology industries in the services of new colonial enterprise of empire. In the case of the Shatila Shabab, their masculinity is neither threatened by their predicaments, nor are they terrorists in the making as a result of the difficulties in their lives. In a sense, the stateless monster terrorist fag and the non-homosexual Muslim man with limited access to power constitute the abject other of liberal feminism and certain LGBTIQ movements. That's precisely why they are retraditionalized and a masculinity stigmatized. Mythologies of traditional Muslim men who may not be as traditional in practice as liberal feminism and LGBTIQ movements wish them to be, feed social fantasies, fear, and anxieties about differences and the other. So how do the Shabab express their gender subjectivities? I invite you to momentarily leave aside this theoretical discussion and observe Shabab forms of self-expression. We'll do that first by listening to the rap they produce and then by watching their pigeon raising. I'd like to show you how two songs reflect the distinct gender subjectivities of the Fidain and the Shabab and their dramatically different biographies. I'll tell you a little bit about the workshops, which, with Shatila Shabab's help, I organized around two songs, Romana, or Grenade, by Samir Shoair, a nationalist song from the 1980s, and Ahlan Fik Bil Mukhayamat, or Welcome to the Camps, a recent rap by the Palestinian band Katibe Ramsey, composed by camp lads. First, I separated the workshop participants into two age groups, one over 30, the other below, and then I brought the two groups together. I had barely finished playing the rap song Ahlan Fik Bil Mukhayamat to a group of men over 30 when the critical comments came flying in. A 50-year-old man criticized the song. This music is exaggerated and false. The singers take advantage of people's suffering. They take us away from the right of return, the liberation, and the new Palestinian state. We accept the fact that we live in refugee camps so as to strengthen the right of return. A neighbor of his was even more vociferous. This can only be the work of Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. Pay attention to the lyrics, listen to the rhythm. This song is completely Zionist. It insults us and our people and has no relation to the reality in the camps. The Thawra, the revolution, will remain until the last Palestinian generation. Even though I was prepared for a strong reaction, I didn't anticipate that the participants would attack the rap for being supposedly Zionist, or even more serious, Mossad inspired. The methodological nirvana I had experienced when organizing the workshops with Shabab let them take the decisions about its formats and conduct the activity, in the end proved ephemeral. It was the Shabab who had suggested to me the two songs we were to use. Let's listen to them. The first, Romana, is about the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and Beirut and the forced departure of the Fedayeen in 1982. So, Mara, yeah, number 2, and just
Okay. Yeah.
واحد صامت بالمخيم قتل الذكريات واخر شو بيجي بتصير الجبريات غيروا المكاتب بس عشان التنظيمات لو عم نشوف الشعب يتدمر بالحرب عشانه صورة السعيد بتضلها صامدة لحالها واللحمة ما بتتوزع اللي عم يحملوا لفتات وبعضهم يضحكوا علينا اصحاب البدلات خلصت الاغاني الوطنية خلص كل بيت اشباح وارواح الميتين بعدهم فلدانين في ناس خلص نسيوا ناس بعدهم متذكرين في صور شهداء محطوا في صور ثاني جايين كل المناضلين بيوا الكلاشينات شعرها بحضان وبقايا رصاصات لشباب كتير ملت من الروح على السفرات لبيوت كتير زهقت من كتر الانهيارات بكره بيبنوا جسر وابلع عمارات ورا كل الخيم البشع صورة الزعيم بتضلها صامدة لحالها أهلا في قهوة في المخيمات 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 شوف مفتوح المخيم شفناها انه خاش على الاعلام بلادي عم بترص الضوء عليها نفس اكبر قضيه باصغر ضرب فيها حمام بالسما وطفل عمال يناديها اكثر ناس عم الله باليها رجل انعرض ممر وبعدين يراضيها وما تتعب لاقيها الراحه ضاطيه طالب يرقص عشان انه يحاول يرضيها فنان يرقص قريبا من بلاد وراضيه بنت وعشيق ومخرب فيها شاب لاخر حتى علم الموسيقى عند الأداء الوصية شباب رائع إذا شفت مورطهم قلبوا عليه وصية عجوز يروي لحبيبي بلادي حكاييها يبقى بوليس رشقية والدمعة تدفيها بيوت جميلة أحلى ألوان وأنقية شفت دفع واحد وفلسطين ومصرية وفلسطين ومصرية أهلا في قهوة بالمخيمات أهلا في قهوة مخيمات أهلا في قهوة بالمخيمات أهلا في قهوة بالمخيمات بس بلا سقف الصوت ومن الخلف حضار وإعلانات حرب المخيمات بداياتنا ومن القدر والطلاق طلعنا انتهت من الحشرات لاش ما عندك الشاب خبر واحد لاش تطبيقيات راح يطلق الله عم الأبواب مسكين بيو أمراض مع العشاء ما حدا سامع فتح الصراخات بالمستشفى وقصر الموت سقاعة الأموات ضارب الجماعة بين لحم الشعراء بين هالنمون العودة عم تحمل
Yeah, can I? Yeah, okay. So the lyrics of the first song, Romana, were not enough to inspire empathy towards the elders among the younger group. A 22-year-old was outspoken. We're all singing for the revolution, like those who celebrate long dead poets. We need to look forward instead of forever celebrating past victories. Arlan Fick reinforced the convictions of the younger group. A 24-year-old set the tone for the discussion. You see, what this song shows are the failures of the Thawra. Till today, we pay the price for the mistakes of the previous generation. What they left for us ultimately is suffering, deprivation of civil rights, humiliation, and subjection. It comes as no surprise then that the general debate, when I brought the two age groups together, neared open confrontation, forcing the Shatila Shabab to exert the diplomatic skills. There must be a reason why people decide to say certain things through song. Malleable, Palestinian rap, instead of consolidating itself as the guardian of a nationalist identity frozen in time, constitutes a discourse about the contemporary. It shows a more nuanced relation to Palestine, indicating that the never forgotten demands for the return need to be combined with more urgent ones in Lebanon, where refugees have no free access to the labor market or the right to own property. Rather than glorifying the battles of the past, it focuses on the everyday as the site of resistance. Not every resistance needs to lead to a revolution. The persistence of the fantasies and ghosts from the 1960s and 70s notwithstanding. I hate having to do it, Gustavo. This was my friend Jihad, 28, complaining about yet another workshop on gender that had been asked to facilitate. Jihad was a social worker at the Shatila NGO. In cooperation with its European counterpart, the NGO was hosting a series of lectures on reproductive health for young Shatila residents, both boys and girls. The European NGO financing the exercise had provided the social workers with supporting material, a DVD and a guidebook, both in Arabic and English, that set out the procedures for the workshop. But Jihad confessed to me that it had taken even him forever to understand what gender was. For the workshop, Jihad used a stratagem to help participants grasp the elusive concept of gender. On a whiteboard, he wrote the word gender, Arabicizing it by placing the article al, equivalent today in English, in front, al gender. He invited participants to share with others what they understood by the concept. He reported, people come up with the most unbelievable definitions. During one workshop, a participant said that gender is a terminal disease. I regretted not having taken part in Jihad's activity. It seemed I had missed yet another golden opportunity. So I did what an ethnographer has got to do. I invited myself to the next workshop on gender that Jihad was due to facilitate in a couple of weeks. I suspect the participant in Jihad's workshop who defined gender as a terminal disease may have had a point, even if the remark was probably unintentional. I want to advance the hypothesis that as a concept, gender does not necessarily work in all settings and at all times. Arguably, throughout academia as a whole, gender has indeed tended to be defined in terms of relations of power and subordination. Through the ethnographic evidence from Jihad's workshop, I argued that if understood solely as relations of power and subordination, gender does not travel well. Indeed, the undue transposition to other ethnographic settings of how the notion has come to be understood in light of important but geographically circumscribed power struggles in Euro-America display some serious heuristic and analytical shortcomings. Once freed from such a limiting framework, Shabab's lives appear ethnographically much richer than those of supposedly brutalizing and brutalized Arab men. One can even sympathize with some of their struggles to build a house, to find a bride, to start a family, or to raise pigeons, and understand that not all fights are about the cock. So let's see how gender is done at the workshop in Shatila. Some 20 boys and girls from the camp took part in the workshop I attended, their ages ranging from 15 to 24. A female facilitator, Rola, worked together with Jihad directing the discussions. It's a pity that here, due to time constraints, I will only be able to describe one of the activities of the workshop. Jihad and Rola distributed green and blue cards to the participants, irrespective of sex. He explained, those with the blue cards can't do anything. Those with the green cards can do whatever they feel like. A male green card holder opted to tease the unlucky girl holding a blue card. Now swap your cards, Rola instructed. It was the girl's turn to take her revenge. Once the activity was over, Jihad prompted the participants to share with others the way they felt when in possession of the differently colored cards. Faithfully observing the manual's guideline, Jihad divided the whiteboard into 2 columns, labeled no power, daif, literally weak, and power, huwa. While in the power position, participants stated that they felt special, that they gained the right to be able to express themselves. The content under the heading no power was more dramatic. When holding the blue cards, the Shatila boys and girls reported that they experienced boredom, humiliation, restrictions, emotional stress, rage, and being blocked and forced into silence. In the end, Jihad and Rola conducted the activity very well, and the European NGO's objective was attained. Indeed, the manual reads, open quotation marks, make the point that gender relations are power relations, and that subordination, power over, should be replaced by cooperation, power with, and empowerment, power to, close quotation marks. I'll now screen another movie by a colleague, Nadia Tropkin, but with a disclaimer. The sky you're about to see is not over Shatila, but Cairo, and this will help you picture what I'm talking about. Yeah, and then there was no sound, right, Mara? Yeah, basically. Every warm afternoon, the sky over Shatila swarms with flocks of pigeons. The breeders of the birds are no longer Shatila Shabab. The practice of raising pigeons was common among the Shabab until some 15 years ago. Since then, it was largely discontinued. I was really sad and angry when the guy from the camp security committee, together with my brother, killed Hanun. Hanun was my favorite pigeon with his red feathers. He hatched at our place here in Shatila and was the leader of my bunch. He used to come to me whenever I called, sit on my knee and eat straight from my hand. Hanun was just like a dog. This was my friend Ahmad, the 31-year-old unemployed accountant we met a few minutes ago, telling me about the tragic end to his years as a pigeon raiser. His father did not anticipate the annoyance he would cause for himself and the neighbors when he brought the teenage Ahmad a female pigeon one day. After a while, Ahmad remarked to his father that he was worried the pigeon was feeling too lonely and that she might die if not provided with a partner. So his father bought him a male pigeon. A few weeks later, Ahmad opened the gate of the coop on his roof and found newly laid eggs. Within a year, the coop was running the risk of overpopulation. It housed 37 birds. All very loyal to me, Ahmad rejoiced. They never flew away. By then, he had begun to fly his pigeons. And so the problem started. While in the sky, pigeons from different flocks sometimes mix. And that's when the hunt aside begins. If one pigeon raiser's birds join someone else's flock, the former will try to attract the birds of the latter the next time the respective bands are in the sky simultaneously. This soon led to accusations of theft and actual fights among the Shabab. Eventually, the Security Committee of the CAIR came to the conclusion that the situation had gone beyond acceptable and decided to step in. Guards from the Security Committee started visiting homes and killing some of the birds they found. Ahmad's household was no exception. A guard came by and, to set an exemplary model for the neighbors, selected 3 pigeons to be sacrificed. Hanun was one of them. With sadness, Ahmad recalled, "I was so angry, so completely out of control, that afterwards I cut the throat of all the remaining pigeons. My mother cleaned the pigeons, and for months they took up almost all of our refrigerator. But after a month, she had to throw the pigeons away because none of us would take a bite." Paraphrasing Guts, it may very well be the case that the identification of the Chatila Shabab with the non-cocks, the pigeons, is unmistakable. And the double entendre here is probably more radically on purpose than with the Balinese of Guts' classic text. Guts presents the Balinese cockfight as a means of expression. Through the medium of feathers, he states, social passions are displayed. The same happens, I believe, with the non-cockfights in Chatila. It may function as a means of displaying Shabab sexual roles. Actually, the Shabab know all too well the difficulties in displaying one's sex roles comfortably can lead to genuine anxiety. In this sense, it's revealing that the Chatila Shabab chose pigeon raising as a pastime, and that they selected birds of all animals as objects of their affection. Immersed into social immobility dictated by utter poverty, without the means to travel, in spite of constantly queuing up in embassies in Beirut, only to have their visa applications rejected, and with the capacity to dream of a future overshadowed by the political economic complexities of the refugee situation in Lebanon, the Chatila Shabab have come to find pigeons with the unencumbered freedom to fly as indeed very appealing. Yes, Marwa, then we can come back to it if someone wants. We, the Victorians, don't talk sex. Sandford argues that the Anglo-Saxon term sex does not capture what the French mean by sexe, and I further contend it does not translate well into the Arabic shins either. Sandford's point is that since the 1950s, sex has increasingly come to be thought in terms of its difference to gender. In the following decades, such a tendency has become all the more pronounced after the feminist movement seized upon both concepts. One of the unanticipated effects of sex being defined in terms of its difference to gender is that the former is hijacked by the latter and seldom receives any proper theoretical attention. We, the Victorians, have never felt completely at ease with these sex talks, as Freysepan's gender is a caixa sexa. Sex, as a concept, works to naturalize the difference between male and female, even though this naturalization has no foundation in reality without the remainder, as attested by the multitude of intersex bodies often formed to conform through painful surgical interventions. In the case of gender as a concept, this differentiation becomes an opposition, and furthermore, an opposition of a hierarchical kind based on different access to power by men and women. Differently from the supposedly natural and unchanging sex, gender could be modified and space opened up for political mobilization. Anthropologists demonstrated how social constructions of the differences between men and women or gender were constitutive of inequalities that needed to be denaturalized. These inequalities served to establish a hierarchy in terms of differential access to power between men and women. This mesmerization by power reached its peak among researchers of masculinity, and prominently so among scholars of the Middle East. In the work of these scholars, enthrallment with power blended into a mesmerization by the spectacle conducted in public. But we have seen that there is no room for the Chatila Shabab within such a framework. So let's try to learn something with the English teacher from Maya Elias. She told us that genes is sex and that genes is gender. Just as Sandford argues that sex is not natural and needs to be open for historical and cultural inquiry, so the English teacher from Maya Elias is telling us that sex, gender in the Arab East engage a differently circumscribed semantic universe. Genes offers enough flexibility to accommodate both concepts, sex and gender. But those of you in the audience who are Arabic speakers know that genes also admits other additions into English, such as race, class, and nation. I obviously have no intention of reducing the sex-gender complex to its linguistic dimension, but I think there is something at play here that we need to pay attention to. Genes can be sex, gender, class, race, and nation, because it brings together those who pertain to the same kind. Rather than setting in relief the opposition between groups, genes emphasize similarities and mutual belonging. When I suggest that we take proper note of this rendition of the sex-gender complex through the notion of genes, what I'm trying to call attention to is the need to historicize and culturalize the complex, open it up to properly reflect our ethnographic findings. This is what I have attempted to do. So the biographies of the Fidain and the Shabab from Shatila. So thanks. Shukran. Obrigado.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. And we have a few moments here. If anybody watching online or in the audience has a question, if you're online, you can type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we can see it and answer it for you. If anyone in the audience has a question. Yes, Marsha.
Thank you, Gustavo. I have to say, I have to encourage everybody to read your book because it's a beautiful book. I mean, it's so very theoretically provocative in the sort of best way, and it also is just full of rich ethnography. And I actually want to say it's path-breaking because we don't have really a ethnography of sort of masculinity in men's lives too much in the contemporary Middle East, and we certainly don't have ethnography that really focuses on the younger generation. And, you know, I just maybe like you to reflect upon that, because in some ways your talk is a critique of the gender scholarship produced not only in general, but for the region. So, you know, why has it taken us so long, I guess, as a discipline to really attend to, you know, gender and what it means for men and men's lives, and young men's lives and refugee men's lives. You know, just thoughts on the sort of genealogy of the work that's been done in Middle East anthropology. I mean, I know that's a sort of broad question, but if you have any thoughts on it, because we know, I would say, like in the last decade or so, we're finally getting some ethnographic accounts of masculinity, manhood, and queer manhood in the region, but it's brand new. It's just, you know, taken so long. It's taken decades to sort of produce this new area of scholarship, of which yours is a really important part.
Should we take some questions? Yeah.
Go ahead and answer that one.
Yeah.
And then we'll let people think and write in the Q&A.
Thank you for the comments, Marsha. Thanks for the question as well. I do believe there is, you know, a question of access actually to ethnographers working in the region, right? So basically at a certain moment you would have, you know, male ethnographers going to the region and observing what men would do in public, because they had very limited access to the so-called domestic sphere. Right. Then we started having, you know, female ethnographers going to the region and having access to the domestic sphere and actually, you know, problematizing the whole public domestic divide and showing that, you know, the domestic world and females world were very political per se. Mm-hmm. The flip side of it is that, you know, I believe there was a sort of invisibilization of men as also gendered subjects in this second wave of ethnography, if we can call it that way. And I think it's relatively recently, you know, through your work and Nefis's work and Farha Khanam's work, that we started paying attention to how men are, you know, made and how the trajectories work in all the spheres, because, you know, this divide we've come to understand that there's quite a bit of artificiality in forming that divide. And I think what I've tried to do, through my work is actually, to humanize those guys, because they are rendered invisible by much of what we write. They are rendered invisible by, a certain individualization of gender that I think is taking place, and that's why I try to present through, this ethnography of this workshop on gender that I observed in Shatila, and it's very, easy to come to think of them as being what I call, as the abject other of certain discourses of, certain, discourse by liberal feminism, or a certain discourse of LGBTIQ lives as well. And I think it's important that, to actually engage ethnographically with them and try to understand their own predicament. So, yeah, I hope I've answered.
Do you have any other questions from the audience or online? If you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A.
I also, can I just make a comment? I think also in the new sort of explosion of work on refugees in the region, because of the post-2011 situation, again, the focus is so much on sort of women and children, and maybe men as, potential, the terrorology kind of, thematics, like who are these men coming into Western societies. So again, looking at young men who are refugees, we have nothing really about what's happening to young men who are moved, and Palestinian young men who've been in these camps for a long time. They've lived their lives in these camps. We just really, there's so little known about their subjectivities. I think it's really important that this isn't only about masculinity studies, but this is about refugee studies as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Someone has coined the terms, women and children together, putting them all together, and I think it's very revealing, because in a sense, it's easy to talk about them because there is expectation that they won't have any kind of political agency. So it's by refusing the political agency, which does exist, that we kind of incorporate them, because you are not afraid of them anymore because they have no agency. And then
they're victims, right?
And they're victims. Yeah. And there is a certain expectation that men on the other side were going to be, full of agency, and including political agency nonstop. And I think that's why there is a certain, academic and political difficulty of actually trying to engage in framing their lives and their gender subjectivities and subjectivities in general. So, yeah. But to get back a little bit to your previous question as well, I think, I've always been startled with the fact that we pay so much attention to, women and men, and to the eventual hierarchies established there, that we tend to turn a blind eye to other kinds of hierarchies. So one of the things that I've tried to do in my work is to bring age and generation, into the picture dramatically, because of course, gender, if you want to keep that word, is going to, suffer certain kind of inflections, the moment that we really inform it by age. And one of the things that, there was a whole talk about intersectionality going on, this part of it, of course. But I think what I've tried to do is, if you want one step further, is what, in terms of method, in the concluding chapter of the book, I call, queering certain notions. So what I've tried to do is what happens to gender when it's queered through agency, it's queered through, access to citizenship and so on. And I try to do the same thing with age and citizenship as well. So I think it's, if you want, it's one step, further in terms of, simply recognize that, of course, gender is going to be informed by age and by, sexual orientation, sexuality, ethnicity, and so on. I think that might be something, it's in that notion of, queering certain concepts, precisely to try to, not to freeze them and see that they change all the time as according to context. So yeah,
that's great. And we have a question here online, you can read too, from Robert Gillespie, who says the Jordanian government has for decades worked to undermine Palestinian masculinity by equating Palestinian dialect and culture with being effeminate and homosexual. Have the Lebanese Palestinian refugees also been subjected to deliberate efforts to question and undermine their masculinity in addition to the challenges inherent to the circumstances of life in Sabra and Shatila that you describe?
Yes, thanks for that question. I think it's quite interesting actually, because in a sense it works the other way around. There's a lot of fear in Lebanon, I would say, of Palestinians in general, Palestinian masculinity, precisely because of certain stereotypes built, through the Fidain actually. So I think in a sense it works the other way around, and because let me bring a couple of interesting vignettes here. I negotiated very carefully my entry into Shatila. For part of the period I was there, was the only non-Arab foreigner living in the camp. And whenever there was some kind of problem happening outside the camp, my Shatila friends would tell me, come back here because here we can protect you. So there was and the other way around, my Lebanese friends would tell me, get out of the camp immediately because it's dangerous and we can protect you if you're outside. Which tells a lot about obligation of hospitality to this vulnerable foreigner that found himself in the middle of several crises. But I think there is something to be said here in terms of practices of care towards me as well. And practices of care, they have traditionally been gendered and feminized within anthropology, I believe. And I think it's quite interesting that we try to see and to ungender, if you will, these practices and see beyond those, and maybe quite a bit going on, beyond those, gendered labels that you use to deploy. So I think there's quite a bit of, fear towards by the Lebanese towards the camps. Several Lebanese would avoid getting into the camps. Actually, the Lebanese authority does not normally get into the camps. You don't have in Shatila, the monopoly, how to call it, the legitimate monopoly of the force. That's why I have come to think of Shatila as an anti-state machine. And this is a question that I get into at a certain point in the book, whether there is a relation, because, you don't have an authority trying to organize a sex gender complex at a local level. And then I wonder to which extent certain discourses on sex and gender are very much linked to state machines, actually. They kind of navigate in the same semantic universe. But, to get back to your question, I think it's the other way around. I think there is, the Lebanese state wouldn't have the capacity, if you will, to promote certain views of Palestinian refugees. But I think there is a general fear on the population informed by certain masculine stereotypes that's very much informed by, stereotypes still going on about the Fidain. So I don't know if I've answered your question. So feel free to provoke me further.
And we have now another question for you online from Nizam Sevi. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I truly enjoyed it. I'm an internationalist, so my question comes from that perspective. How would that constructed masculinity in Shatila be different from the masculinity of second-generation North African migrants in the suburbs of Paris, or from that of young male favelados in Rio de Janeiro?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I think the same Lisa that I know. I don't know if that's.
It might. He's here now. North Africa.
Thanks for that. It's interesting because that question comes very often whenever I give this presentation. A colleague of mine, a Brazilian colleague of mine, did the work comparing a Brazilian favela to a refugee camp in a Palestinian refugee camp in northern Lebanon. One of the things that I think, we kind of understand as anthropologists, it's in a comparison is quite difficult, right? Because, for one feature that you can find in common, you can probably come up with 25 others that would be different. So I think it's important to pay attention to context, and I'm pretty sure that that's going to be marked differences between the way masculinity is lived in a Brazilian favela or among North African refugees. So, I mean, I'm not that acquainted with North African
like the context.
Yeah. So I cannot answer to you along those lines. I'm from Rio, so probably, I've never done any ethnography in Rio, but I'm from Rio. And it's quite something going on in Rio in terms of relations from Brazilians middle class with the favelas. Quite a bit of connection going on there. There is a beautiful book that just came out by a Brazilian colleague of mine called Minoritarian Liberalism, that actually portrays the life of a travestile in Rocinha, which is the largest favela in Rio, and basically comes up with the idea that certain expectations of, in terms of gender and stereotypes, they may not work in a place like Rocinha, and there may be a kind of, minoritarian liberalism going on there. So it's just to indicate to you that, I think it's definitely very important to pay attention to context. So, but thanks for that question. It's quite difficult to engage sometimes, with people doing international policy. I think as ethnographers, precisely because, we must sell ourselves in a certain society. And on the other hand, I think it's quite important actually to, be able to grasp some of the limited commonalities that may exist there, because they might lead to some important contribution in terms of policy, right? So yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you. And I saw Bish's hand earlier.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I was really interested in your entire presentation, but I was really taken by the case of Nawaf in the beginning, and his relationship with these kind of activists who kind of valorize him, but seem to be particularly drawn to him precisely because of his status as a fideh. And so I'm interested in how these kinds of outward presentations of Palestinian masculinity to Western onlookers, to humanitarian workers, to international onlookers in general, the extent to which they may be played up or downplayed in efforts to secure aid, secure attention. I'm more familiar with the kind of situation in the Western Sahara, where male refugees may tend to kind of downplay masculinity and really play up the matriarchal arrangement of their society to Spanish solidarios in order to secure attention and aid and solidarity. So I was wondering if that was something that is kind of going on, how maybe Palestinian men present outwardly to aid workers and activists.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I paid quite a bit of attention on how they would self-portray themselves depending on context. So sometimes they would play the bravado of, the masculine refugee man, playing a little bit with, the stereotype of the Fedain actually, to impress some girls. Sometimes they would, play the role of a working class person needing to have access to some kind of scheme, or so sometimes they would define themselves as not just being Palestinian but also young men. So I think it's they would mobilize different kinds of their multi-layered identities according to context, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? I paid quite a bit of attention as well on how they would portray me, and how that would vary according to context as well. So from being seen as a white middle class person researcher, just another researcher coming to the camp, and that's why they say they would give me a hard time. That's where the title of the book comes from. They traditionally give a hard time to people coming to the camp because they say they're just tired of all these researchers and journalists coming here, and then they kind of boycott you and your questions and so on. And then when I was there, an American ethnographer came, she was a political scientist actually, she came to do research in the camp, and they observed me giving her a hard time, and kind of boycotting some of her questions. They were proud of me because, I've learned their way. And I went through a brief siege in Beirut, and a Palestinian friend came I always kept an apartment outside the camp. When it was, just a bit too much, I would go out to take notes and so on, take a couple of days, to recover. And when the siege happened, I was in this apartment outside of the camp, and a Palestinian friend, he couldn't get back to the camp. So he came and he kind of taught me how to go through a siege. And I was the vulnerable person there. So that's why I started thinking of, gender, because, I'm dealing with powerless men here, men with limited power. And that was my case in that specific situation. I was a man with very limited power because I didn't know how to behave. And he kind of, educated me on how to go through a siege. Why did I start telling you this story of, I completely missed the point. I will eventually get there again. Yeah, I completely missed the point, but it did have a connection with the question at a certain point. Yes, it was basically because then, when the siege was over, he went back to the camp and he reported to the other guys that I didn't panic throughout it. And then I was promoted to hardcore Palestinian. The guys were really proud of me for having gone through a major crisis without panicking. So I thought it was quite interesting how, the portrayals of me as well would vary according to context. On aid, there is quite a bit of, gendered perspectives, I would say, both for people searching for aids and on the part of UNRWA, the UN agency, deals with Palestinians and NGOs. So there is a certain expectation that, if you are a man of a certain age, you shouldn't be looking for aid, even if you're unemployed. So families that were on the list of UNRWA to have access to aid, the moment the guys, the sons, they come of age, they cease to be on that list. There's the expectation they should be able to provide for themselves, even if they can't find jobs. And it would be very demeaning, I believe, for a man to look for aid. So I did have a couple of contacts with UNRWA officials working in Shatila and outside of Shatila, and normally it would be women that would look for it. And it was quite, and there you go, to get back to Masha's question about children and women and children without agency. I observed it that actually in one situation when aid was distributed, the women would just, sell whatever was being offered to them right in front of the UNRWA officer, which I thought was just fascinating. You think that, I'm entitled to 2 cans of oil per month, but what I really need is, something else. And I'm going to sell that and trade for something else, which I think is quite interesting as well. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your questions. I think we have to wrap up now due to time. In the chat, you'll see our information for our next talk. And if anybody wants to continue the conversation with Gustavo afterwards, we can do that also. So thank you guys very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.